We're going. We're moving. We're starting. Grrr.
This is gonna be one of those episodes.
Oh, yes.
The next couple of weeks, to be fair, are gonna be one of those episodes.
Yes.
It's gonna be so much fun.
I have lots of energy. John has lots of energy, and we're starting a nice little recording sesh. Look at me. I'm down with the kids, even though I'm only 25.
I'm 30. Ew.
You're old.
All right. Cheers. Thanks.
Probably just insulted most of our audience.
Yeah, you have,
Apologies.
because I'm probably we are the young. I think we're kind of the youngest of the audience. I think.
I'm not sure. I mean, we don't know the age of our audience. Anyway, let's get to talking about something a little bit more exciting than people's ages, because that could be offensive. So I'm told anyway. I mean, yeah. Digital gardening and note-taking. Note-taking we've sort of spoken about, but the digital gardening aspect, not so much.
This is going to be fun. This is. I'm waiting for you to explode, quite frankly, because of the notes on. Literally, when we kind of came up with this episode that we were going to do, all I put in my notes is gardener, librarian, architect, Danny Golden rant on this one. And so, like, the plan is to let him have the floor, let him release all the ranty energy, and then talk about my shift from Notion to Obsidian and longer form writing and moving beyond just gardening and, stuff like that.
I think I'm gonna preface this with two things. One, when we say gardening and digital gardening, I'm going to define what that is and sort of explain what it is first, because some people may not be familiar with the term. And I'm going to preface all of this with my life at the moment is a little bit stressful, so I'm probably going to release some of that stress in forms of enthusiasm. So apologies up front. Digital gardening essentially is where you create a blog or create a publish zone area for other people to access, not necessarily the world to access, but other people to access, that is your notes. And those notes could be as formulated and as condensed as you want, or as messy and like mine as you want, which can be anything. They could be pictures, they could be audio recordings, words, or anything. Essentially, it is a garden. It is your space of information dumped somewhere for people to access. Doesn't have to be everyone. Maybe it's just a company, a team, or the world. It's up to you. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's a pretty good definition, honestly. I mean, I have thoughts on garden. Lovely. I have thoughts on gardening, but I'm going to let you go first because I'm very excited for this round.
I'm going to try and keep it brief and short, but the gardener, librarian, architect model framework thing that was suggested a while ago by Anne-Marie and then promoted all over the place by every influencer imaginable on YouTube and Twitter, which was interesting. The framework is interesting, it's nice, but the way I see it is they are categories, and I'm not a big fan of categories or labels anyway to start with. So as soon as you start categorizing people and labeling people, it brings in constraints. And constraints and affordances are not something I like to mess around with when it comes to learning, because when you're adding a constraint, it means you can also take it away, which is a label, which means if you can add a label, you can also take the label away. And what people have done with this framework is they've attached a app to it or a way of note-taking to it. But if you attach an app or a piece of software to a label that can be taken away, well, now you have a system in an app that's reliant on the tool. But then if your label then changes, now your app has to change, which means if your label is changing in different contexts, which we will go through later, then it means you're going to change app every context. And I mean, I don't know about you, but changing app every context is not fun. It would not be very easy to do. It's certainly doable. I use Notion for collaborative work and Obsidian for personal work. But if you're changing app for every context, every time, that to me, there's a bigger friction point, which I don't think there's a problem with the framework. I think there's an issue with potentially the application of the framework. And I'll let you.
Yeah, go. And I mean, from someone who created a framework about personalized productivity, something that I really specifically say in that conversation is these aren't boxes to sit yourself in. They are starting points, baselines. They're like, this is this is how you defaultly function. This is your defaults that you can adapt and change and build on. It's supposed to be about understanding, which I think is what Anna-Marie's original idea was, around understanding the types, but it's turned into this app war again all the time. Meaning there's like, oh, you only use Roam if you're a gardener, and you only use Notion if you're a librarian, and you're only using this app and this app. No, those
you got it wrong. No, Notion's an architect. Yeah.
Oh, is it? Right.
Evernote is a librarian, but Evernote has now changed the app so you can do things that you couldn't do when it was first made. So now it's actually also useful for architects. But then,
and so this is why context is really freaking important, because it changes. Because if it's designed around the apps, when the apps change, you get pushed into another box that you're not comfortable with. Like, I always saw librarian as kind of the Notion, because a librarian stores information. So for me, Notion, I'm sorry, is good at storing information, but when you really want to create something, especially from my own, and once again, context is key, context is important from my own context, Notion is not great for actually creating like that flow of content that can create that, what's the word I'm looking for? That ability to just come up with ideas at random. You have to think to create ideas. Now, if that's how you like to function, and you like having like tracks to go down, and that's good for you, then yeah, fine, great. But for me, as I began to develop my content more, I realized that Notion didn't work for me anymore, because I wanted to start having that there is a word I'm looking for, not spontaneity, but for me, I can't find it right now.
Freedom.
Yeah, the freedom to just see stuff happening, and oh, I spoke about this in this article and made notes on this, and then here they're also talking about the same thing over here, and now I can connect the two and make something really quite cool. And that is not available in Notion unless you over-engineer it. You have to over-engineer it in Notion. There is no spontaneity, there is no flexibility, there is no freedom. It just goes in there, and the effort that Notion, you have to go with Notion to create those connections is too great for me. And that's...
I was going to say, I'm just going to add something in, because I know a couple of the listeners that do use Notion. Notion isn't like a bad tool, and you can do it. It's limiting if you don't understand the features. So it's more complicated to get started, I think, with a fluent system in Notion because of the way that it works with databases. But once you understand that, which I don't think it's going to take that long for people that are fairly tech savvy to understand. But when you're in that system, there are certain features that if you don't want, it's fine, you can go through. But if you do want those features, well, then you need to look for another application. And I think Notion works when you have a goal, an overall project, an overall thing you're going towards. So I know a couple of people are doing a PhD, and they have PhD as their thing, as their topic. So all of the notes, the things that they're collecting, it sort of directs it. There is one rough direction it's going towards. It's not like you've got a note that could go in 7 completely different directions. They're all heading in roughly the same direction. The same with businesses and teams. There is a rough goal direction that it's going in. But if you're just learning in general, which I am doing as an internet academic, I can grab a note, and it could be related to sport, it could be related to business, it could be related to just personal health development. And those 3 areas are drastically different. So how in the world do I put that in one database and relate it to everything all at once? And
I mean, I went for ages doing it. Once again, as we say all the time, context is key. My context shifted. My context changed. I was just storing information, not actively turning it into content. It took me a long time to actually move into what I needed for my brain to function. And I think that's really important, and nobody... In the discussions around apps and technology, especially in the space that we're in, we're always talking about which one is better. Well, they all have their uses, they all have their benefits, their drawbacks, and it's about figuring out what works for you, trying not to go too far into context, because that's our word for today. But that's the thing, it's understanding what you need. And gardener, librarian, and architect, to go back to our topic, is a way of thinking. But if you limit yourself, like, you can be a gardener in Notion, you can be a gardener in Obsidian, you can be a gardener in Evernote. Like, it's not an app that makes you a gardener. It's not an app that makes you a librarian or an architect. It's not about the apps. It's about how your brain naturally functions. And I think that we need to shift away from this app specific categorization, because I have been at fault before where I have put those, rings around apps, because that's kind of what human beings do. We like to categorize things to make it easier to understand. And then, of course, we want to add in our own biases to make ourselves sound like we are actually doing the right thing. And so we have all of that lovely psychology layered on top of that, which makes us do stupid shit like Notion is better than Obsidian. No, Notion and Obsidian are very different tools.
I could rant for ages, but yeah, I completely agree. And I think, that was my main my main point with my little bit at the beginning, is that the framework is a framework, which is great. It's useful. But attaching constraints, attaching apps to it, don't like that. It's boxing, it's categorization. I understand it from like a science thing. You need to chunk information so you can remember it all, whatever. So throwing out the science there, it's like, okay, fine. But the thing with the analogy and the 3 words, 3 words is kind of like the marketing trio. People love to put 3 words on things, and 3 words this, 3 words that, or mnemonics and the rest of them. Like, that's great, but maybe there's more, maybe there's less. There's tendencies, context obviously matters. And what I get irritated by is when people reference it, or they talk about it, they cite it. I know we're going to talk about citations and stuff in the next episode, but when they talk about this thing, this analogy, they bring their own perspective in, which is great. They bring their own interpretation in, which is great, but then they change the original point of the analogy. So now you're not using the analogy, you're using your own interpretation of an analogy, which isn't based on anything apart from your experience and your context. But from my experience, a lot of people don't say, in my opinion, or in this context, or don't use this in that context. So you sort of leave out things and let people assume. And when you let people assume, normally they will assume the easiest thing possible.
Yeah, so you're talking about something that it's a tangent, but we're going on it because I've already done this rant once in the workshop that I ran in a group around SMART goals. That is marketing. And in fact, my coach, when we were talking about SMART goals, came up with a wonderful acronym for SMART. I'm going to read it because I can't remember what it was. Stupid marketing assholes ruining things. And that's the definition. Like, if you look into the studies, and this is going into next week's episode, isn't it? If you look at the conversations and the studies behind these popular marketable ways of working, you realize there's so much missing. Planning fallacy. I'm diving into that one at the moment. And there is so much context that's been missed. So much context that has been missed.
Yeah, and that's where I think we can link this episode and next week's episode, because the context of the note-taking, the digital gardening, the note-taking you have in your system, wherever it is normally vast. There is a lot of breadth to it, and the digital gardening space allows you, or gives you, the affordance to share the breadth. But when you're sharing things as a finished article, a published piece, whatever it is, whether that's written or audio or a show or Broadway, who knows? A lot of the time, breadth is left out because you need some sort of depth, which restricts context. And as soon as you start restricting context, you leave out some things and you make it look nicer in this way. And okay, now you've actually made this assumption, and now you're getting rid of that, and actually you're now misinterpreting this, and now you're bending, and you end up Chinese whispers. You end up with something in the end that's almost completely misrepresents what the original sources started with. Sorry?
Feynman technique.
I wasn't going to go there, but yeah. That's what was going on in my mind. And for those that are unfamiliar, the Firemen Technique is a technique that was essentially made up by someone that made a video and read a bibliography of Richard Feynman. And Richard Feynman, when you watch some of his interviews talking about teaching and learning, he essentially contradicts what the Fireman technique does. So he has a technique named after him that I think he would disagree with. And you're like, what is going on here? And it's just marketing. You've got a famous name on there. You've got a technique in there. And you've got a book that's sold loads that talks about it. And you've got loads of videos that talk about it and articles that talk about it, but no research to back it up.
I love how we've kind of gone on to the next episode already. Let's just
yeah, bring it back.
Come back here. Come back now, Daddy. Come on.
Yeah.
Next week's episode.
So but relating this to you're the one that put me on Firemen Technique. But relating this to the digital note sharing, in my notes on the Firemen Technique, on all of these things, my notes are broad. They have a breadth of information. They're all over the place, which is useful for me, but not necessarily as easy to consume, which is where digital gardening is. This is a question actually I'm going to ask you. When it comes to digital gardening, obviously it's us, it's our work. Traditionally, it's a personal wiki. What are your thoughts on other people being able to comment, share thoughts on, or potentially even edit your digital garden?
I don't like it. I'm not a fan of that because it's my garden that I am creating. And if someone starts editing and changing stuff, then it becomes something else. Now, in the interest of learning, sure. But I don't necessarily take notes to learn, it's to process. Like I'm learning through the consumption of media, through the consumption of books, through the consumption of stuff. And then I'm turning that learning into something else. And so for me, like the way that I have designed my, digital garden, it's for me. It is my personal garden, and I have a gate round the outside. No one's coming in. If I receive context,
electrified, like you ain't getting in.
Yeah, and I don't, because I was debating this like recently. Obviously, you've got your Obsidian public, and I was like, would I actually want to make my Obsidian public? And I'm like, no, because the amount of pressure it would put on me as a perfectionist who likes to have things in a way that where I would start to self-edit because of doubts of what the opinion of others would be. Now, whether that's just a personal thing, but at the end of the day, I think every human being cares what other humans think. Even if you say you don't, you really do. And so for me, I want to be able to say what I want in my private notes, figure out what's going on in my head, and then turn it into context. That is marketable, because at the end of the day, that's what people want. They don't want the big details. And that's something that I learned with my content in the last 6 months. A lot of what I do is relatively heavy. It's summarized as best as possible, but it is far deeper than it's no one's going to be searching it on the internet, that's for sure. So for the people who love what I talk about, it's great. But for the people who need to know what I'm talking about, it sucks because it's not helpful. And so that's where my shift has come of like, okay, how can I bring depth and specificity with context neatly in a package that people want to consume? And I think that's a challenge for creators all around the world. And I think there is a risk. We can very easily, and it's easy to sit on our pedestals and go, you should provide context for everything, and you should do this, and you should do that. But also it's hard. It's not something that's you can do easily. I mean, even you yourself, you've been like, how do you actually want this context? Because I can just give you everything, but like, and people were asking you to change things and wanting this and wanting that. And it's like, but that's not how my Obsidian works. Do I have to rebuild it to suit you? No, that's not the damn point. If I'm rebuilding it for someone else to access, which is exactly what would happen with my Obsidian, I would have to rebuild it so that everyone else can access it.
Interesting. So I completely understand that perspective, and that's the perspective I had before I went to Obsidian Publish. My mindset changed drastically when I did go for publish, because I said in my head, very similar with what we were talking about, I think a couple episodes ago, about me like adopting a new habit, is it's my notes, and if you don't like my notes, tough shit, like go away, goodbye. So I am curious with feedback. At what point would you, accept isn't the right word, but I can't think of a better word right now. At what point in the note process would you sort of like want to see some feedback? I'll let you think about that one, because it's kind of a difficult question. It's a question that I had
very
to.
much it is a difficult question. I think for me, at the point of content, when I have summarized my thoughts, because often what I talk about is kind of not necessarily half thoughts, they're just kind of top of mind. I think that's where even so this context, like from a podcasting context, this is top of mind stuff that I'm thinking about. This is my own thoughts, like just spat out everywhere, and they will change over time. And I'm launching a podcast in the new year that is literally just me doing similar things like this, and I'll be releasing, I'm gonna say, daily. That's the plan. Yeah, I know.
That's basically that's basically your daily journal there.
Yeah, pretty much. It's going to turn into the kind of like, this is what I'm thinking about. And it will be a transformation of my notes into a context that's easily digestible. And I think for my audience and for what I want to be doing, I would rather receive feedback there when I've got my thoughts, I have my ideas. It's kind of like my obsidian is the map of like ideas that's like, oh, look, there's a connection there. It helps me to make the connections faster without having to think outside. And then from there, it goes into something that I can produce, like a podcast. So that's kind of my level to answer your question of like, when do I want feedback? When I share it, it's like, it's when I want feedback when I'm ready to receive it.
So like, I'm going to ask a follow-up question. Well, when do you decide when you're going to share something then? The reason I ask is because for me, again, this is like personal, but for me, I didn't like sharing things. This is going back a few years now. I didn't like sharing things. I didn't like letting people in. I didn't like having conversations about things that were going on in my head. And I rattled around for lots of different things, personal and business and academics. And I rattled around in my head arguing with myself. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with someone, whether that was a therapist or whether that was an academic or whether that was like a friend or a parent or whatever. And I realized actually having a conversation helps a lot. And it took a long time for me to develop that ability to go, actually, conversations are useful. Conversations are helpful. And as much as I don't like I don't like the initial feeling of, oh no, they may completely hate this. That's literally what learning is. Learning is you having some sort of pain, whether that's emotional, most of the time it's emotional, or some sort of threat towards you, your potential intelligence, whatever it is. And unless you're challenging yourself in that sort of way, you're just essentially revolving in your own thoughts, which I know is useful. But I wonder, like, where's that? Okay, let's start this conversation now. How do you make that decision? Because for me, I've gone really early on in the process now, but it's taken a long time for me to develop that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my instant reaction to that one is when I'm ready. Like it's I know when I talk about it, I'll talk about it. Like when I open up this conversation, I will open up the conversation. Like I don't have this is when I share.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes I share things really early. Sometimes I share things really late. Like I have developed it over time and it's very clean and beautiful. And I think, interestingly enough, that's the shift in my content. I'm going to sneeze.
While you sneeze, I'm just going to say that with your shift in content, I've noticed it and I've seen it. And it's interesting that you say some things you want to share earlier and other things not so much. And I don't know whether you've thought about it, but is there something in your mind that goes, I know more about this, or I think I know more about this, or I just want to share this? Like, what is the trigger? What's the difference?
I think it goes to a point of excitement. Like when I can explain it in a way that is useful and valuable to people, what I think is useful and valuable, which is probably my own brain, like blah, blah, whatever, emotional stuff. But yeah, it's to a point where I feel that a conversation is warranted, when I know that I've reached the limits of what I understand and I want to get more context or thoughts or opinions.
That's exactly what I thought you were going to say, which is why I asked the question like 10 minutes ago. Because from my research and from what I know from my experience in teaching and coaching, most of the time people are willing to share something when they are excited enough that they understand something about it, which is, I mean, this is part of my PhD anyway, or potential PhD, and sharing information. When people have a sense of understanding about something, they are more likely to start a conversation about it. If they don't think they understand it well enough to have a conversation, whatever understanding means to them, then they're not going to talk about it. And obviously understanding is context specific, which is why I was sort of like probing, because I was curious to see if you would say it kind of like I don't know, like a pre-PhD guinea pig right there. But yeah.
You're welcome. I'm glad I can provide for you. But yeah, and I think it's that is kind of how I have been feeling for a long time. But there is a shift. Like I can feel a shift in like, I have something to say, which means I'm going to say stuff I don't fully understand. And that's where I am. I'm in that precipice of like, fuck it, I'm going to share anyway. And that's where, and I think for me, moving on to our second point, that's how Obsidian has helped me, because it's helped me just to throw shit at a wall and see what sticks. And kind of like one of the things I talk to my coaching clients and every single client I have is get it out of your head. Is always just your brain cannot process all the ideas you're having if you just store them in your head, limited amount of capacity. And so throwing it out into Obsidian has really helped, because Notion got in the way. For me, it got in the way. I wasn't ready to put it into Notion, so I just put it into Obsidian, because Obsidian is far, far too easy to put stuff in. Now, that has its own freaking problems.
I was going to say, this is going to be a great transition.
That has its own freaking problems. But it provided me with the space, the brain space and capacity to just look at what things I was looking at and things I was thinking about. Because my brain goes off in so many directions pretty much all the time, and they never, ever stop. My wife mentions one thing, my brain goes, that's interesting. What am I? Huh, cool. And the idea is that it's the squirrel. It's, bringing back. It's the squirrel. It's like, oh, cool, yeah. I like that. Oh, yeah, look at that. Oh, more info. It's just like being able to take those little nuggets, because there's so much in them, which is what I find exciting. And that's what is causing me to shift my content in the new year. I'm going into the very annoying traditional newsletter model, where basically you just share what you're thinking and then you share links to loads of stuff. And also because it provides conversation, which I think is incredibly valuable. Mm. And I think I'm moving, and I'm on that precipice of like, fuck it, people aren't going to like it, goodbye. But I still don't know whether I would share my Obsidian, which is an interesting thing for me to just sit with. Like,
yeah, I was going to say, you're not going to get an answer by the end of the podcast.
No, but it's an interesting thing for me to sit with. There's like, I'm not sharing my Obsidian. Why? I like that. That's kind of a good question to sit with,
to ponder. Yeah, you might have to note that down so you don't forget it, because we've still got a bit of talking to go. And it's interesting that obviously we're transitioning to the Obsidian and my recent video, which is what we were talking about before we actually started recording, talking about the issue about long form writing and sort of moving the notes from either the smaller notes, the condensed notes, or the processing notes, or whatever notes you want to call them, atoms, molecules. I know some people use that, and whatever you want to call them. It's moving notes, personal notes, wiki notes, whatever you want to call them, into something that is an article, that is an essay, that is a video, that is an entire dissertation. How do you do it? Where do you do it? What small, really nuanced issues may you come up with? And for those that haven't seen the video, those in academics, we need to cite stuff, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But citations in Obsidian could be done in 3 different ways. All 3 ways have their own unique friction points. So does that mean you need to use a different tool for this one thing because of the context? And yeah. I saw you like looking, so I thought you were going to say something, but and then I'm going to extend on to that, sort of like bringing in the digital gardening with the longer form note taking. Well, okay, so I used Word as an example in the video. Microsoft Word is atrocious on almost every count, except from integrations with things like Zotero and EndNote for adding in citations and automatic bibliographies at the end, which are alphabetical, which Obsidian doesn't do, which I would love it to do. But Word, you can't share that. You can't really have a conversation with that. I see you frowning, but you can't really share that very well online anyway.
I was just thinking, sorry, is there not a plugin that can automatically organize your footnotes?
There is a plugin that says better footnotes. It changes the aesthetic and does organize it a little bit, but because of the way footnotes are working, they just go down in order. So it's like 1 is 1, 2 is 2, 3 is 3. So
I hate how footnotes work in Obsidian.
Like, I love how footnotes work because they're so simple and easy, but when you're trying to do a bibliography, no, just no, because you can't use the one. Well, in academics, you can't use one. You need to use whatever citation method you use. Most people use Harvard. I know I use Harvard. So you can't use the footnotes in there unless you use the Harvard method in the footnote, which means you'd need the name and the date, which means you'd have to go to the article, put the name, put the date, then put the comma, and then the name and the date for the next one. But there needs to be a different footnote. Then it needs to go down the page. And if you use the same footnote again, you need to make sure all the capitalization, all the spacing and stuff is the same. Otherwise, it doesn't reference it the same way. Yeah, small irritations. And the same kind of thing within Notion with you got the backlinks. Even once you've done it, you need to make sure you've cited it right in there, but then you can't do the bibliography in Notion. You'd have to bring it over to Obsidian, bring it over to Word or something like that, and then use EndNote, Zotero, whatever, inside of Word to create the thing. But that's an academic specific use case, which is extremely contextual. But when you try and publish stuff online, well, now you've got a different sort of issue, because if you're doing it on a website, well, do you do footnotes on your website? Do you cite your notes? Do you cite an article? If you're citing an article, like I mentioned in the video, if you're constantly citing other places, people are going to be on other websites more than yours, which means, like, from a creator's perspective, that's not great for retention. But from I want to share my knowledge with people, but I can't explain this thing very well, I want them to go over there to read it. It's kind of like an ethical, moral issue with, do I want people to stay on my site, market well, and do better for me? Or do I want to help the person that I'm trying to teach and send them off in a different direction?
I think that's I don't think that's a problem. I think there is a common marketing thing that you have to be always on your website, but I don't think that's necessarily true as we're kind of developing. I think there are easy things you can do when it comes to, like, specifically websites here. I mean, the other stuff is not me, unfortunately. But like for websites and marketing, there is no harm in you doing the footnotes, link to the bottom, and then just have it appear in a blank tab so that people can just go to a blank tab. Your website is still there on the left-hand side, and then there is, like, the context to dive deeper is there. I think that's a way around it. I think it depends on your belief of marketing. I personally, when I start doing more detailed stuff, I will very much be linking to contexts and articles and all that lovely juicy stuff, because I think it's valuable. I think it provides an option, and also I don't think it's an actual problem, because the vast majority of people, I don't know whether they would actually, from my context as a business coach, I don't know how many people would actually dive deeper into the subjects. It would just be like, oh, he left his references. That's a kind of a form of showing that you know what you're talking about.
Credibility, a little bit.
Yes, that's the word I was looking for. A sign of credibility of being like, hey, I know what I'm talking about. I've linked to these people and these studies because this actually makes a lot of sense. So
I'll save it for the next episode.
I did that on purpose. Yes,
I know, because Yeah.
Obviously, you can just link to blogs or the actual papers themselves. You never link papers themselves.
I think the lateral reading aspect is really useful. I'm going to rephrase my word. I said problem. I'm going to rephrase it and use what I got told at university loads. It's a moral dilemma. Yep, moral dilemmas. And it's not necessarily a problem for you or for them. It's just something that there's going to be conflicting opinions about it, conflicting perspectives, and you need to work out what your perspective is and what you are going to choose to do, which is essentially the marketing business aspect. But what are your thoughts on the longer form articles in business? Would you suggest, I don't want to put a number to it, but is there like roughly how many pages, how many scrolls, how many words, or like what would your thoughts be on that? Because I don't read that many business articles.
Yeah, business articles often are quite it depends on the context, what you're trying to teach.
It depends.
It depends. Well, yeah, because it always does. Because you can have these massive long form articles, and actually there's kind of, I wouldn't say citations, but kind of like links to sections of the piece of work. So having that in there, like headings and stuff, which you can of course use in Obsidian. Honestly, I don't have enough context of writing long form writing in Obsidian, because I do what I tell everyone else not to do and just write in WordPress, because it's there, it's bad, but I do it. If I'm still piecing together my thoughts, I may put it in Notion because I can reorganize paragraphs much better than Obsidian. But yeah, I don't have a strong feeling on that from that perspective. But honestly, Google Docs has a place. I can't touch Word. Word.
Yeah, you said about WordPress, and that made me think of Wikipedia. For those that are listening may already know, but I've been using Wikipedia quite a bit, and the talk pages on Wikipedia look absolutely disgusting when you go to type anything in there because of the way that it's formatted, because it's old formatting, it's old code. I say code, it's not really code. But it's essentially markup. And to make a new line, so whenever you respond to someone, you need to put a colon in front of it. So if you've got like 4 comments, you've got nothing in front of the first comment, then you've got a colon in front of the second comment, then 2 colons, then 3 colons, then 4 colons, and then you'll have a DP inside 2 curly brackets to go down a line with a line, so that it's still fitting on the page. And obviously you've got all the brackets, curly brackets, square brackets, all of the greater than, less thans, in the middle of text for all the links and things. So when you go to edit the source, it's literally a block of a load of symbols and letters. And if you're not familiar with Wikipedia's talk pages, it looks so disgusting.
Yeah, I remember you showing me recently, and I just was like, I don't get this. You want me to go and edit pages? Nah, I'm good, thanks.
The rest of the pages are fine because there's a what you see, what you get editor, essentially. It's a visual editor. I'm like, yeah, that's fine. As soon as you go to the talk pages, no.
Yeah, but I think that talking is where the kind of cool parts of it are.
A bit of both. There's so much to Wikipedia, and like I've told you, like I'm going to do a video on it because it is essentially digital gardening, but global digital gardening. It's essentially what Wikipedia is, because everyone can edit anything, and you can keep track of anything and everything. Like yesterday, this morning I saw someone had edited one of my pages. Well, someone had edited one of the pages that I had edited a few times. A couple of the edits were just completely wrong, so I reverted them and then said comments, this is rubbish and this is vandalism, goodbye, and got rid of those. And 3 of the other vandalisms that the person had done on other pages had been taken away from other users, so that was easy. But one of the other edits, he just corrected a capital T because I didn't put a capital T on the after a full stop, and I was like, thank you, because my grammar and spelling is trash. But loads of those things just happen. I'm like, oh yeah, someone saw that and corrected it. Him writing dick in the middle of a sentence, no, that can go straight away. But yeah, it was obviously a child. But yeah, so context. Context. For those unfamiliar with this segment, John is going to explain it. We need some background. We need some background music for this. This segment is.
Yeah, I know, and I need to have enough time to actually put some background music in there, and want to do that. I mean, we could, and then you would have to split it up into 2 sections and do it that way. Would you like to split the stuff up into 2 sections?
It wouldn't take long, would it?
No.
I just look at the timestamp, be like, okay, that timestamp, I'll just note that down on Obsidian, of course, and then when I go through, just get to that point.
So yes, this section is us talking about our meanings of words, because the meaning is in people, not in words. So basically, we both have a word that we've agreed to kind of describe our own thoughts and feelings on. Neither one of us can see the other person's notes on it. We each have a page in Notion where we basically make up to 5 notes. I never make 5 notes ever. And then we kind of go back and forth discussing it and giving our opinions and thoughts on it. And we also would like you to do the same thing, either in the YouTube comments down below, because we're on YouTube now, doing it on YouTube again, or via Twitter or anywhere. Just at the end, what are you laughing at?
Yeah, we're on YouTube. I just forget to post it and then post 3 in a week.
Yeah, I noticed that. What then?
Well, you went away and I forgot to schedule it, and then we came back and I was like, oh shit, I got 3 episodes, let's dump them all out a week. I scheduled them as well, and they automatically went to midnight, so I got a ping on my phone at midnight on Discord.
Yes, like, I know. Yeah. Me too.
I was like, oh yeah, I scheduled that, didn't I?
Yes. Well, okay, fine. Well, if they're not scheduled on time, we all know who to blame. Whereas if the podcast isn't scheduled on time, it's my fault. But guess what? The podcast is always scheduled on time.
Like, I'm calling you out. As soon as one is missed, by even a day, I'm calling you out. I mean, I've missed episodes by like 4. Actually, no, because I was in charge of the episode beforehand, so I missed like the last episode of last season. So yeah, I'm like a year out of date. So.
Oh wow, yeah, you really did. They're like, oh yay, the Notion nerds are back, and I'm like, we've been back for weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Let's stop insulting me now.
Why? Literally, season 1 was you insulting me the entire time. I thought I would return the favor. No. We are. It's equality here. It's all equal. No one is better than no one else. Do you see how the fact that he literally sniggered at that fact? Yeah. Elitist. Okay, so it's the first time we've started insulting each other since season 1.
Old men first. Your word, John. Are you okay? You're having a bit of a giggle fit.
Yeah, I haven't had one of them in a while. So, for me, context is
a word.
A word, yeah, it's a word. It is a magical word.
You've got it written down in front of you. Why are you?
Yeah, I know.
I'm
trying to, because my first note was the fertile void, which I'm trying to explain because this is the concept in psychology, in Gestalt psychology, where it's kind of the bits that happen where you can't see. So right now, as you're watching the video or listening, your focus is on what I'm saying or what my hands are doing if you're watching the video. But if you stop and disconnect from what I'm saying, there is always stuff going on behind. There is, my background that's there, that exists. And that's kind of like the fertile void, to summarize it and simplify it as stupid simple as possible, because the whole episode can be done on that. And that will be done on my podcast. And it's the idea of the stuff that's behind, the stuff that's important. And without it, you wouldn't be able to keep moving. It's the stuff that's deep inside you that you've taken in over time. It's the fact that I'm sat on a chair, but you can't see that chair. The chair is there. I'm sat on a chair. That is context, but you can't see that. You don't always see context.
Yeah. I mean, my first point is similar. I summarized it in a different way. I just said physical, social, and emotional environment. And the analogy I was going to use, which may help your explanation, I'm not sure, is I have an analogy in my head about a mental spotlight. So in our minds, we have a mental spotlight of where our attention is. That is what we're thinking about, what we're doing. That's the physical, emotional, and social environment that we are currently engaged in. That everything around the spotlight, i.e., a stage, everything on the stage is still there. It still exists. Without the stage, you wouldn't be standing there. But the spotlight isn't on the stage; it's on the character, on the person, on whatever it is.
Yeah. So that actually is an example. So to
Yeah.
use your analogy and put it into the psychology aspect, like the spotlight is the figure, it's the main focus of attention, it's the thing that your awareness is directed at. And then you have the stage and stuff is the ground, it's the parts of us that aren't thought about but are actually there, because our brains move from one to the other and to the other to the other. We each go from contact to withdrawal and continue to do that over and over again. We make contact with something, decide it's fine, withdraw from something, and then go on to the next object. An exercise I do with my clients is, if you look around the room, which you can do in a second, you'll notice how your eyes just go. You're not naturally just looking smoothly around the room. Your eyes ping to certain objects as you move. And that's kind of you switching context. The other objects are still there. The context is still there, but you don't see them.
Yes. Yeah. And what I want to say with relating to the spotlight, which may cover another point, is when it comes to context, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there, obviously. And when you say something and you say something in the spotlight without acknowledging other things, if you move, i.e., if the spotlight that's on moves as the character and then collides with something else, if you haven't acknowledged that something else, whoever's watching the spotlight is going to be very, very confused because you haven't acknowledged it.
Yeah. So kind of one of my other points is the bringing together of ideas, beliefs, thoughts, and feelings in one place. So bringing it all together. It's like the combination of everything that makes up ourselves, because context is, as we keep saying over and over again, context is everything. The context of where I'm sitting right now, the conversation, like Danny is highly charged because of what's happened to him this week. This is stuff which he brought to attention, because having that context is so key. And in business, when everyone suggests what apps to use, they just talk about the app and don't think about the context. They don't talk about what is important. And so the advice given sucks. And I have a whole 7-8 page thing, or no, 5 page now. We managed to bring it down, so you can actually go to that. I'll include a link of where I dive deep into this whole topic, because it's fun.
It is. I think my second point kind of works with it, but I've said time specific, and the reason I've said time specific, I'm going to use an analogy that may lose some people here, but when you're looking at an object, you can't actually physically see the back of the object, but you can predict what is there. So when you're looking at a mug, you can't see the back of the mug, but in your head, you can visualize the back of the mug. So at a different point in time, when you have seen the back of the mug, you've gone, oh, okay, there's a mug, there's a back of it there. So when you're looking at something straight on, it's at a different point in time, but you still have a visualization of the context. But if you haven't had prior experience with something, so a different point in time, if you haven't had prior experience, you don't know how to predict what's on the other side, which is where we try and predict the future. And context, if you don't have prior experience, prior beliefs, prior knowledge, predicting context in the future is extremely difficult because you don't have anything to go on. So it's a different point in time.
Yes.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I think it's very much, I like that. That's a good specificity of, like, it is time based. It's based on stuff you've already had before. The bits that you don't see, the behind the scenes bits, the bits we don't talk about. That's kind of one of my points of, like, the bits we don't. I'm actually going to change that. The bits we don't talk about isn't quite right. We should be talking about it, but we don't. It's just stuff we're unaware of, but we are also at the same time aware of. We're just not aware of our awareness of what we're aware of.
For those interested to explore a little bit more, consciousness and the idea of what consciousness is essentially where this analogy comes from. And Neil Seth, I believe, is the guy that I first heard it from. And the idea of the Bayesian brain hypothesis, it explores a little bit more into prior beliefs. And I will leave it on that. I will leave those two words there if you want to explore. I won't bother going any further. Next point.
Boring.
Boring. That's
your next point.
Part of my PhD. Call it boring.
No, boring. You didn't go into it. Is what I was meaning.
Oh, right. It's extremely complicated and complex. And like I said in the Firemen Technique video, if you're explaining things in terms people can't visualize or understand, then they're just going to get confused and it won't retain anything. And actually, that relates to my next point, which is level of understanding. And I think context and level of understanding is highly important because depending on how you define understanding, which doesn't have a definition because it's a philosophical word and term that changes in communication, but essentially understanding requires knowledge, blocks of knowledge, chunks of knowledge to generate links between those things, those knowledge, which arguably is belief and trust and other stuff, to create this narrative around something. The narrative is your understanding in that context, in the environment, with that perspective, with that frame of view, with that prior belief, prior knowledge, etc. So as soon as you add something new, add a new piece of knowledge, add a new belief, add a new challenge, add anything new, it's not going to change the narrative, but it adds something new to the beliefs, which Bayesian brain hypothesis essentially says, okay, now I need to reassess my knowledge, reassess my beliefs, because knowledge is beliefs, and then reassess my level of understanding, which then can potentially change the context. I know there was a lot of words in there. Do I need to explain myself better, or is that good?
No, I think that's good. I mean, you probably will, but not. I like your conversation.
Okay. So. Is there anything you want to expand on with that, or you?
I think actually one of my next points, we're heading musical now because that's my background of like. No, I'm not going to sing for you. No, not yet. So
not yet. I pinged that word yet.
Of course you pinged that word yet. So the idea in music, I'm going to simplify it as best as I can. There are kind of harmony and there is melody. There's also a hell of a lot of other things, but we're going to specify on these 2 points in relation to context.
Bass. Sorry.
The musical puns are going to come flying out.
Dear.
So, melody in this instance is the kind of the spotlight in your analogy. The melody is the focal point. It's what people focus on. It's what people pay attention to. However, the meaning of the melody or context of the melody will shift depending on the harmony behind it. So I'll use chords as a simple thing, which is three or more notes that are played together to create a different kind of sound, to evoke different feelings. And so you can have a piece of music which is really happy. For example, I've actually done this before with a friend of mine. We did Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and then we changed the harmony underneath it and tweaked it ever so slightly, and it turned into other songs because we were able just to tweak how the music was played, how the harmony was shared, and everything started to shift and change and move, and our own kind of context moved with the context between what was the focus or the spotlight changed. And so the context for me is the kind of chords behind the melody, the stage behind the spotlight, to use your analogy earlier. It's the bits you don't see, but without you could not continue.
Yeah. My fourth point I kind of covered with level of understanding, which is perspective and prior beliefs. So
I was trying to avoid using words that we'd already done in previous episodes. Which was really, really hard. And it's amazing, actually, just to riff on that a little bit, of like how these words that we're using all relate to each other in some way. And so the meaning of our words, even meaning was a word we actually did, because what is meaning, what is truth, what is context, what is belief, what is this, what is that? Like, the idea of opening up these conversations, I think, for both of us was to go, hey, what does that mean to you? What is that? What is it? What are these words that we're talking about? The words we use all the time. Prior belief. What is that to you? What is belief? You know, what is prior? No, what is belief? What is that to you?
And I think to add on a little bit of nuance in here is, as soon as you add a word with another word, the meaning changes.
Yeah.
Belief as a word, if you add a word before it or a word after it, you're now adding something to the spotlight. So you're actually changing the context of the word, therefore potentially changing the meaning of the word, because prior beliefs is not necessarily something you would say in a sentence unless you're referring to prior beliefs in the Bayesian brain hypothesis, because that's essentially the only place those two words are used together in science, but they are also used just in general explanations of what beliefs are. So it's actually interesting when you're reading, interesting to me anyway, when I'm reading articles about what beliefs are, people say prior beliefs. And I'm like, are you talking about the Bayesian brain prior beliefs, or are you just talking about your prior beliefs, as in beliefs you had before this thing? Because prior beliefs are slightly different. And it's the same with the word understanding at the moment, because people say, oh yeah, I understand that. Do you understand that, or do you just have a perspective on that? Because having a perspective and understanding something are different things, because there's different levels of understanding. And again, we could go riff on understanding or what understanding is, but context
We've
will
already
change.
done that.
Well, yeah, context will change if you've added a word before or after something. And context matters is my last point, because I didn't know how else to.
Yeah, mine is pretty much context matters. It is like, it matters. It's way too important, but no, it's so easy to dismiss it because it's there and not pay attention to it.
I don't know whether you're going to agree with this, but again, this is just me putting some thoughts out there. Again, going back to my notes, just dumping everything out and seeing what people's opinions are. But the bell curve, traditional statistical bell curve, are you familiar? Yeah,
familiar. Yeah,
yeah, where you've got like the bell majority are in the middle, and then like less on the outsides. I the way I see context and nuance is, a lot of people focus on the middle of the bell curve. Like, this is where the majority of people are, and they leave out the different areas of context, which sort of goes further and further out in the bell curve. And those nuanced situations are typically not necessarily forgotten, but just overlooked or ignored for whatever reason. Sometimes there's justification for it. They don't want to overload something. Other times there isn't. But the assumptions for people that are in those like edges of bell curve, and when they're watching this middle thing, is, okay, have they accounted for my situation? Most of the time they haven't, and that means the person on those edges of the bell curve need to recognize this wasn't for me. This isn't advice for me. This is advice for people in the middle. On the average, I am different, so I need to take that and apply it to my context. But how do I do that? And the how do I do that in my context is exactly what you do. Like, how does it work for me?
Yeah, and that, I think, is, especially in the business world, the world that I inhabit, and in fact in the productivity world, which we both inhabit, everyone is trying to just stay in the middle because it's easier, because it's marketing.
You get more views.
You get more views, you get more attention. But for me, from my context, I care more about the people on the outside than on the inside of the bell curve, because that's where the magic happens, in my opinion. That's where the real shit happens. That's where, leaders are born. That's where people who want to make a change live, outside the bell curve, or kind of on the
middle
outskirts. Outside of the middle of the bell curve is where people, like,
I mean, even though it's a small percentage, that's still millions of people.
And I think often in marketing, we think about kind of just like more. Just give me more people, more things, more. We are a world of consumption and getting more. I mean, we're recording this around Black Friday and Cyber Monday weekend, of like, give me moreness. I want more. But sometimes it's like, you need context, and sometimes it's small. And I love the niche stuff. That is more
Seth Godin. That's literally what Seth Godin talks about. Like just I can't remember the exact quote or anything. I'm going to butcher it anyway, but he was saying something like it's better off making a course for 5 people and making an impact than making a course for 1,000 people and not doing a thing.
Yeah,
something along those lines.
That's where my attention is moving from. It's why I haven't done a Notion course. That's why when I teach people how to build a business in Notion, it is through masterminds and a long-term relationship, because context cannot be made in a single call. Context is not something that can occur in one single 1 hour call, and every single call the context changes.
I agree with the second bit. I don't agree with the first bit. There is a context in the call, but
I don't. Well, there is only one. It is the context of now.
Yeah. I would probably rephrase it and say it's not the context you would want to work in. You're building towards a context that or a narrative. Yeah.
It is where you are right now rather than where you want to be or what you're talking about, depending on the context of where you're with me and why you're talking to me.
You're at the stage door. You're not quite on stage yet.
Yeah, you're at the stage door trying to figure out how to get on stage and whether you even want to be on stage or whether that's the right stage. There's just so many layers and layers, which people just want to get on stage. I'm going to riff a little bit on that. Like for me, I have spent the last 1.5 years being asked one particular question. Do I want to be known? Or do I want to be a best kept secret? For years, I've been the best kept secret. I've just sat in the background, hidden, but my context has shifted. I have something to say that I feel is important because there are people on the outside who need it. And so that's where my context has moved from every little thing I've done over the past 2-3 years of like moving from wanting to have my message known and sharing something that I feel is important. My context has changed. And I think we often think we have to stick with one way and we can't change and we can't move and we can't shift our context. Like in the Notion space, you have to always use Notion. You have to always use this app or that app. It's one app to rule them all. It's one productivity tool. It's one productivity this or that or this or that. But context changes every single second.
Yes. Mic drop. End.